Whoops.
If you need a lesson on how to use go around a flat corner fast, I'm here for you.
Santa Cruz started from scratch with the new Bronson. Still has 150 millimeters of rear travel, but there's a 160 millimeter fork up front, and the shock is now mounted low and driven by a lower link. The reasoning behind going with the new suspension layout is to give it a little better small bump compliance, more support in the mid-stroke, and nearly invisible bottom out. So basically, just make it feel better over the big stuff. So they also wanted to improve the pedaling performance, and so all of that was part of the reason they went with the new design. It's clear that it borrows DNA from the longer travel Nomad, and its geometry and amount of travel places it squarely into that aggressive trail or enduro category. The first Bronson debuted all the way back in 2013, and each year we've seen it get longer and slacker, and no surprise, this bike gets longer and slacker as well. They took a degree off the head angle. The new head angle number is 65 degrees. Seat tube angle gets a little bit steeper as well. That's at 75 degrees, and it's got nice and short chain stays at 430 millimeters. The reach grew, but not to the extremes that we're starting to see some companies go with. It's 455 millimeters of reach for the size large. There's also room for up to a 2.8-inch tire in the rear. One thing that's worth pointing out is up front you have a Fox 36, and in the rear there's a RockShox Super Deluxe. Two different major suspension manufacturers. You don't always see that mixing and matching, but Santa Cruz did some testing, and they liked the way the Fox felt up front and the way the RockShox felt in the rear. So the model we have in for testing here is one step from the top line. It's the X01 model. Costs $81.99 US dollars. The one we have, it's also worth mentioning that it received the upgrade to Santa Cruz's reserve carbon rims. And these are the ones with 35 millimeter internal width and some big 2.6-inch rubbers.
The climbing on this bike is really impressive, and I think the thing that stands out for me is how quiet the rear end is. I'm not talking noise, but I'm talking action. It basically doesn't move. I don't want to reach down for that switch. I think they're cheater switches, and you should never have to reach down for it. And with the Bronson, I didn't have to. And it was actually a little bit better in the tech stuff than I thought it was too. I was surprised.
Yep, I agree. And even compared to the previous one was no slouch when climbing, but it had a little bit less small bump sensitivity, I'd say. This one stays active when you get into rough stuff, but it's also really calm. So you can stand up and pedal, sit down, pedal, whatever. You don't need to reach for that switch.
Now the one issue that I have is that it felt like it was sitting deep in his travel. I'm at 30% sag, but it always felt like I was deeper, and I know you didn't have that problem.
I didn't have that problem, but it is a bike where you know it does feel like it has 150 millimeters of travel. You're not going to mistake it for a super efficient cross-country bike, something like that.
And it is efficient, but when I say sits deep, I always had that feeling like it was just like, lean back into it, and that was at 30% sag. But again, overall, it was a good climber, especially when we talk about pedaling efficiency. So enough with the climbing, let's get to what this bike is really for, the descending. What did you think?
Yep. I think it's a great balanced feel. It's not the absolute slackest or absolute longest bike out there.
The suspension is so competent, and it just erases everything. If you told me it had more travel than it did, again, I would believe you. And I think you described it best, actually. You said it's a very heels down bike. Heels down, go through all the things, no matter what is in the way. Rocks, boulders, houses, cars, anything.
Yep, you can definitely plow with this thing. And then compared to the Nomad, its bigger brother with more travel, it just feels a little bit more manageable too. So if you get in some terrain that's not quite as gnarly or just maybe a little bit more rolling, it still feels like a really fun bike. You don't feel like you're over-biked, per se.
It's a 150 mil bike that's not gonna hold anybody back. I would do enduro races on this thing.
It doesn't bottom out harshly. You can hit really big things. I hit some pretty sizable drops, especially in the wet or end times when you need more traction. That's when that kind of more supple sensation is nice. That's when the wheels are just stuck to the ground. The one we've got came with 2.6-inch tires, so really just smooths out the terrain underneath you.
This bike is definitely going to suit one person more than the other. I like a bike that stays high in its travel and is playful, and maybe it's not stuck to the ground as well, where you're more of a guy that is just all-out traction, I think.
Yep, yeah, I definitely prefer traction, and I didn't have any trouble getting this bike off the ground. You know, I never was like, oh, it's just not going to bunny hop or it's not going to do that. And one thing, speaking of how it's traction, cornering. Cornering is where this bike, it really shines. I mean, pretty short back end, and like I said, not a super long front center, so it's easy to just be right in the middle of the bike and just rail a turn. So let's talk about the parts on this bike. It's obvious that whoever chose these at Santa Cruz rides bikes. Yeah. I can't think of anything I'd really change, especially like the fork, the Fox 36 with a new Grip 2 damper. It just, especially around here, we get a lot of repeated big hits. It just maintains its composure, saves your hands, which is pretty huge if you're blasting through braking bumps all day. Also, big brakes, code RSCs, you got 200 mil road up front, 180 in the rear, plenty of power, same thing. Steep terrain, just like where this bike works well, it's nice to have those on there.
Mm-hmm. So you can actually get the Bronson with 2 different kinds of wheels and tire options too.
Yep, you can pick, there's an alloy option, but then in the reserve carbon wheels, there's a 30 mil internal width and a 35 millimeter internal width. And that bigger internal width comes with 2.6 inch tires. We tried both. I think we both came to the same conclusion of what we preferred.
The smaller size. Yeah, now the big high volume tires, they definitely mute the trail a little bit. I just prefer a more traditional feel. And also if you're gonna race on this bike, you might want the smaller volume tires too.
I think it's a great all-rounder, and by all-rounder, I mean you kind of need terrain that can match the bike. 150 millimeters of travel. It's better if you got some big descents and some big climbs that you can take it on. A
big pro to this bike is the efficiency. We've talked about it before, I just said it again. Relative to what it is, this bike is very efficient. There's a big con for me. We're gonna get some heat here. It's not a 29er. Now, Kazimer?
Yep.
I know they already make one.
They do make one. They have a 150 millimeter 29er, but it's not this bike and it's not this suspension layout. And that's the difference. Just the way this bike feels, it makes you wonder how it would behave with 29-inch wheels. Mm-hmm. We'll see if that happens.
I think it would behave very well. I think this is a great choice for someone who's going to do some enduro racing, someone who rides some serious terrain, wants an efficient bike, wants a bike that's very forgiving.
Santa Cruz did a great job with the updates on the Bronson. Just kind of solidifies its position in this category. There's really not much we changed. It didn't get super long, super slack, but what they did is just made it just right. And that's what we're looking for.
So that was the 2019 Santa Cruz Bronson. Stay tuned for more bikes from our field test because we have plenty more coming up.